Prison guard tortures black inmate. Years later, the inmate returns as their boss. The room fell silent as every pair of eyes turned toward the new warden walking into the prison's central hall. Standing tall and composed, his dark suit was sharp against the pale walls of the facility. But it wasn't his attire that caused the murmurs among the guards. It was his face, unmistakable and unforgettable. The whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that?" one guard asked, his voice barely audible. Another nodded grimly, his face pale. Inmate number 45178, the man they had once mocked, humiliated and tortured, was now standing before them as their boss. The weight of the moment crushed the room. The guards, particularly one named Derek, couldn't believe it. Derek had been at the center of everything, the beatings, the isolation, the cruel jokes. And now, years later, the tables had turned. "Good afternoon," the man spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "My name is Brian Harris, your new warden. Some of you may remember me." Derek's throat went dry as Brian's gaze locked onto his for a brief moment before moving on. The air felt heavier, the room quieter. Brian's voice carried authority, but beneath it, there was a hint of something colder. "Let's discuss changes," Brian continued, stepping toward the podium. But before he could finish, a sudden bang echoed from outside, shaking the room. Guards scrambled, unsure of what had happened. Chaos erupted. 10 years earlier, Brian Harris was a young man wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. A fight at a local bar had ended in tragedy when a man was stabbed, and Brian, a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, became the prime suspect. Despite his innocence, the trial was swift, and the sentence even swifter: 15 years in Greystone Correctional Facility. Brian had entered the prison system naive and hopeful, believing the truth would eventually set him free. But Greystone wasn't a place for hope. It was a place where men were broken, and guards like Derek Simmons thrived on making sure they stayed that way. Derek had been a veteran guard, a man who saw prisoners as less than human. Brian, young, proud, and unwilling to conform to the brutal system, quickly became his favorite target. It started with insults. "How does it feel knowing you'll never see freedom again?" Derek sneered during Brian's first week. When Brian ignored him, Derek escalated. He'd find reasons to punish him, smuggling contraband that didn't exist, breaking rules that were never explained. And the punishments? Solitary confinement, beatings, and worse. One night, Derek dragged Brian into the showers under the pretext of a routine check. It was far from routine. Derek and 2 other guards beat him until he could barely stand. "You think you're better than us?" Derek spat, kicking Brian one last time. "You're nothing. Remember that." For months, Brian endured. He fought to keep his spirit intact, but Derek was relentless. The abuse continued, both physical and psychological. Brian knew he was being targeted not just because he stood up to the system, but because of the color of his skin. Derek made that clear in every slur, every insult. But Brian wasn't broken. Instead, he plotted. In the quiet of his cell, he vowed that he would not let Greystone destroy him. He began reading law books, psychology, anything he could get his hands on. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, detailing the corruption and abuse within the prison. Most went unanswered, but one letter, sent to a non-profit legal group, sparked interest. A young attorney named Jessica Powell took on Brian's case. Over 2 years, she worked tirelessly to uncover evidence of his innocence. Witnesses who had been overlooked, security footage that had been ignored, it all painted a different picture of the crime Brian had been accused of. Eventually, the truth came out. Brian was exonerated and released. But freedom didn't mean forgetting. Brian knew he couldn't walk away from Greystone without making sure no one else suffered the way he had. He went to law school, specializing in criminal justice reform. He rose through the ranks quickly, earning respect for his determination and brilliance. And when the position of warden at Greystone became available, he applied. Now, standing in the same place where he had once been beaten and humiliated, Brian was in charge. But this wasn't just about power, it was about justice. And for men like Derek Simmons, it was about accountability. As the chaos outside grew louder, Brian turned to the guards. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'll handle it." The guards exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to challenge him. Derek, however, stayed frozen in place, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. Brian hadn't come back just to run the prison. He'd come back for something more. And Derek had a sinking feeling that he was about to find out exactly what that was. Brian stepped out into the prison yard, his sharp gaze scanning the chaos. Inmates were shouting, guards were scrambling, and the sound of boots on concrete reverberated in the tense air. In the far corner, an alarm light was flashing above the west gate. He approached a cluster of guards huddled near the commotion. "What's going on?" Brian asked, his voice calm but firm. One of the younger guards, clearly shaken, stammered, "An inmate." He tried to make a run for it. Cut himself on the barbed wire trying to climb the fence. Brian's eyes followed the direction of the guard's trembling hand. A man was lying on the ground, his arm bleeding heavily as two guards pinned him down. The inmate, wild-eyed and desperate, struggled against their hold. Brian recognized him immediately, James Carter, a name he remembered from his own time inside. James had been a quiet man, mostly keeping to himself, but the years had clearly worn on him. Brian crouched down beside James, gesturing for the guards to loosen their grip. "You'll tear his arm off if you keep that up. Step back." The guards hesitated but obeyed. James glared at Brian, his breathing ragged. "What do you want?" he spat. "You're one of them now?" "No," Brian replied, his tone even. "But I'm the one who can help you if you let me." James blinked, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. He didn't resist as Brian motioned for a medic to come over. Within moments, James was being tended to, and the situation began to de-escalate. But Brian's mind was already racing. The desperation he'd seen in James's eyes was all too familiar. It was the same desperation he had felt during his darkest days in Greystone. Brian turned to the head of security, a burly man named Carter Reeves. "Why wasn't this prevented?" Reeves bristled. "He's a troublemaker. Always has been. We can't watch everyone every second." Brian's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Guards like Reeves always had excuses but rarely solutions. "I'll review the reports myself," Brian said coldly. "In the meantime, ensure the inmates' grievances are being heard. Desperation like this doesn't come from nowhere." Reeves didn't respond, but the set of his jaw spoke volumes. Brian didn't care. He wasn't here to make friends. As the yard settled, Brian returned to his office, his mind still on James and the system that had pushed him to the edge. He sat at his desk, opening the thick file on his first task as warden, an internal review of the guards. Derek Simmons's name was at the top of the list. Brian leaned back in his chair, a flood of memories washing over him. He remembered the countless times Derek had dragged him into solitary, the taunts, the slurs, the unrelenting cruelty. Derek had been the embodiment of everything wrong with Greystone, a man who thrived on power and prejudice. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Jessica Powell stepped in, a welcome sight amidst the weight of the day. She had been instrumental in his journey to freedom, and now she was one of his closest advisors. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, setting a stack of papers on his desk. "Not a ghost," Brian replied, his voice measured. "Just old demons." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, Simmons?" Brian nodded. "He hasn't changed. If anything, he's worse. But I need more than memories to deal with him." Jessica slid a folder across the desk. "You might find what you're looking for in here. Complaints, disciplinary warnings, reports of excessive force. He's been untouchable so far, but with you as warden." Brian opened the folder, scanning the contents. Each page confirmed what he already knew about Derek, but seeing it in black and white made his anger burn hotter. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about ensuring no one else endured what he had. As the hours passed, Brian immersed himself in the files, piecing together the web of corruption that had festered under the previous administration. Derek wasn't the only problem, but he was the most immediate. Brian needed a plan, one that would not only hold Derek accountable but also set an example for the entire staff. The next morning, Brian called a meeting with the senior guards. Derek was there, his smug expression barely masking his unease. Brian began by addressing the recent incident with James Carter, emphasizing the need for change in how grievances were handled. But then, he turned his attention to Derek. "Officer Simmons," Brian said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I've reviewed your record, and I'm concerned about some of the patterns I'm seeing." Derek's smirk faltered. "With all due respect, Warden, I've been here for 20 years. I know how to do my job." "Do you?" Brian asked, his tone icy. Because it seems to me that your methods often cross the line. The room fell silent. The other guards shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of Derek's reputation but unwilling to speak up. Derek, however, wasn't one to back down. Prison isn't supposed to be comfortable, he shot back. These men are criminals. They're here to be punished. Brian's expression hardened. Punishment is the court's job. Our job is to maintain order and ensure the safety of everyone in this facility. If you can't do that without abusing your authority, then you're in the wrong line of work. The tension in the room was palpable. Derek's face turned red, but he didn't respond. Brian let the silence hang before dismissing the meeting. As the guards filed out, Derek lingered, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Brian. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath before leaving the room. Brian watched him go, his mind already calculating his next move. He knew Derek wouldn't go quietly, but that didn't matter. Brian had survived worse, and he wasn't about to back down now. Later that night, as Brian reviewed more files in his office, a loud crash shattered the quiet. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. A guard burst in, his face pale. "Warden," the guard said, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." Brian followed him down the dimly lit corridor to the east wing. When they reached the scene, his stomach churned. An inmate was slumped against the wall, blood pooling around him. A group of guards stood nearby, their faces grim. "What happened?" Brian demanded. The guard who had summoned him hesitated. "It looks like a fight. But there's something else." Brian's eyes narrowed. "What?" The guard glanced at the others before speaking. "There are witnesses saying Simmons was involved." Brian's chest tightened. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. But as he stared at the scene, he knew this was only the beginning. Brian knelt beside the injured inmate, his sharp gaze darting between the blood-soaked concrete and the guard surrounding the scene. The man, barely conscious, was gasping for breath. His face was swollen, his lips split, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Get the medics here immediately," Brian ordered, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The guards hesitated. Some exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure how to proceed under the weight of the accusations surrounding Simmons. Finally, one of them hurried off to fetch medical help. Brian stood, his face unreadable, and turned to the rest of the guards. "Everyone who witnessed this incident will submit a written report by the end of the night. No exceptions." One guard, a younger man with nervous eyes, stammered, "Warden, I didn't see much. It all happened so fast." Brian's gaze landed on him, piercing and unyielding. "Then you'll write that down. If anyone withholds information, I will find out." Derek Simmons was nowhere in sight, but his absence only confirmed what Brian already suspected. As the medics arrived and the inmate was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, Brian's resolve hardened. This wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was an act of cruelty, the kind Derek had perfected over the years. Once the scene was cleared, Brian returned to his office, his mind racing. Jessica, who had stayed late to assist him with the mounting challenges of the job, looked up from her laptop as he entered. "What happened?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. "An inmate was beaten badly in the East Wing," Brian replied, his voice low but steady. "There are witnesses implicating Simmons." Jessica's eyes widened. "Do you have enough to take action?" "Not yet," Brian admitted, sinking into his chair. "But I will. This isn't just about him. It's about the entire system. If I move too quickly without solid evidence, the other guards will close ranks. I can't afford that, not yet." Jessica nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You'll need someone on the inside. Someone who's seen everything but hasn't been fully corrupted." Brian considered her words. Most of the guards at Greystone had long accepted the toxic culture that thrived there. But not everyone was beyond redemption. He thought of the younger guard from earlier, the one who had hesitated to speak up but seemed uncomfortable with the violence. "I might have someone," Brian said finally. The following day, Brian called the young guard, Ethan Matthews, into his office. Ethan looked nervous as he stepped inside, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Sit," Brian said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ethan obeyed, his eyes darting around the room. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Brian replied, his tone calm. "But I need to know what you saw last night." Ethan hesitated, his face pale. I didn't see much, Warden. I swear. By the time I got there, it was already over. Brian leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Ethan's. I don't believe you're a bad person, Matthews. But I do believe you're scared. I'm not asking you to incriminate yourself or anyone else without reason. I'm asking you to help me uncover the truth. Ethan's shoulders slumped. He looked down at his hands, silent for a long moment. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw Simmons. He was there when it happened. Brian's pulse quickened. What did he do? Ethan swallowed hard. He started it. The inmate, Carter, was arguing with another prisoner. Simmons stepped in, but instead of breaking it up, he escalated it. He hit Carter first, hard. The other guards followed his lead. Brian's jaw tightened. This was the confirmation he needed. Will you write this in a report? Ethan looked up, his eyes wide with fear. If I do that, the others will come after me. Simmons won't let me walk away from this. You won't be alone, Brian assured him. If you stand with me, I'll make sure no one retaliates against you. But I need your help, Ethan. We can't fix this place unless people like you are willing to do what's right. Ethan's face was a mix of fear and determination. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it. Later that evening, Brian sat in his office, reviewing Ethan's report. It was detailed and damning, providing a clear timeline of events and naming Simmons as the instigator. Brian knew this was the beginning of the end for Derek. But as he prepared to initiate the formal investigation, a knock at the door interrupted him. Jessica entered, her face pale. You need to see this, she said, handing him her phone. Brian took it and scanned the screen. It was a news article from a local outlet. The headline read, Prisoner alleges systemic abuse at Greystone facility. The article detailed years of alleged misconduct, citing anonymous sources who described physical abuse, racial discrimination, and corruption among the guards. This came out an hour ago, Jessica said. And it's already spreading. Reporters are going to start digging into this place. Brian's grip tightened on the phone. The timing couldn't have been worse, or better, depending on how he played it. As he handed the phone back to Jessica, a voice crackled over the intercom. Warden Harris, there's been an incident in the West Wing. You're needed immediately. Brian's heart sank. Another incident so soon? He stood, his mind racing as he followed the guard who had come to summon him. When he arrived at the scene, his worst fears were confirmed. The West Wing was in chaos. Inmates were rioting, and several guards had barricaded themselves in a control room. At the center of it all, Derek Simmons stood with his baton raised, shouting orders to a group of guards who looked ready to attack the crowd. Brian stepped forward, his voice booming over the noise. Enough. The chaos froze as everyone turned to him. Derek's eyes met Brian's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. This is your last chance, Simmons, Brian said, his voice cold and commanding. Stand down, or I'll end this myself. Derek smirked, but it was forced. You don't have the guts, Harris. Brian took a step closer, his eyes locked onto Derek's. Try me. The tension was electric, the air heavy with anticipation. No one moved, no one spoke. It was a battle of wills, and everyone knew that the next move would decide everything. The silence in the West Wing was deafening. Inmates, guards, and even Derek Simmons stood frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Brian didn't flinch, his eyes locked onto Derek's with a steely resolve. Derek's smirk wavered, replaced by a flicker of anger. He turned to the guards behind him. You gonna let this guy walk in here and act like he runs the place? One guard shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The others avoided eye contact, clearly uncertain. Derek realized his usual authority was slipping, and his frustration grew. I said stand down, Brian repeated, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Derek clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on the baton. For a moment, it looked as if he might charge at Brian, but then something shifted. Derek's grip loosened, and with a sneer, he dropped the baton to the floor. Fine, he muttered. But this isn't over. Brian didn't respond, his eyes following Derek as he walked away. Once Derek was out of sight, Brian turned to the remaining guards. Get these inmates back to their cells. No violence. I'll be reviewing every incident report personally. The guards hesitated, but eventually obeyed. The inmates began to shuffle back to their cells, their earlier fury tempered by curiosity. Many of them had heard rumors about the new warden, but seeing him stand up to Derek Simmons was something else entirely. Brian stayed in the West Wing until order was fully restored. As the last of the guards filed out, Jessica arrived, her face a mix of concern and urgency. "I just heard," she said. "What happened?" "Another power play from Simmons," Brian replied, his voice weary. "But it's done for now." Jessica shook her head. "You know he's not going to stop. This was a warning shot. He's testing you, trying to see how far he can push." "I know," Brian said, his jaw tightening. "But the more he pushes, the more rope he gives me to hang him with." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Figuratively, I hope." Brian gave a tired smile. "For now." The next morning, Brian called an emergency meeting with the prison's leadership team. Derek was notably absent, and Brian didn't bother pretending not to notice. "We're at a crossroads," Brian began, addressing the room. "This facility has been operating under a broken system for too long. If we don't make changes now, we're going to see more violence, more chaos, and more headlines like the one that broke last night." He gestured to the screen behind him, where the article exposing Greystone's abuses was displayed. The room shifted uneasily, the implications sinking in. Brian continued, his tone firm. "From this moment forward, every incident of excessive force, every allegation of misconduct, will be investigated thoroughly. And any guard found guilty of abuse will face immediate termination, and possible criminal charges." There were murmurs of dissent, but Brian held up a hand. "I'm not here to debate. This is happening. If anyone has a problem with that, my door is open for resignations." The room fell silent. Brian could see the resistance in their faces, but no one spoke up. He knew it would take time to win them over, or weed them out. As the meeting ended, Carter Reeves, the head of security, lingered. Brian had been expecting this. "Got something to say?" Brian asked, crossing his arms. Reeves frowned. "You're making a lot of changes, Warden. People don't like change." "I'm not here to make friends, Reeves," Brian replied. "I'm here to make this place better." Reeves leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Watch your back. Simmons isn't the only one who doesn't like how you're running things." Brian's expression didn't change. "If anyone has a problem with me, they know where to find me." Reeves straightened, giving a slight nod before walking away. Brian watched him go, the weight of the warning settling heavily on his shoulders. That evening, Brian walked through the cell blocks, something he made a point to do regularly. He wanted the inmates to see him, to know that he wasn't hiding behind his title. As he passed one cell, James Carter called out to him. "Hey, Warden." Brian stopped, turning to face him. "Carter. How's the arm?" James shrugged, wincing slightly. "Better, thanks to you. But you know that guard Simmons? He's been talking about you." Brian tilted his head. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that makes you want to sleep with one eye open," James replied. "Word is, he's planning something. Don't know what, but it ain't good." Brian nodded, his face unreadable. "Thanks for the warning." As he continued his rounds, Brian's mind raced. Derek wasn't the type to let things go, and James's warning only confirmed what Brian already suspected. Derek was planning something, but what? That night, Brian was awakened by the sound of an explosion. The floor beneath him shook, and alarms blared through the prison. He threw on his clothes and ran toward the source of the commotion. When he reached the East Wing, the scene was chaos. Smoke billowed from one of the utility rooms, and inmates were yelling through their cell bars. Guards were scrambling to control the situation, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Brian demanded, grabbing the nearest guard. "Someone set off a bomb in the utility room," the guard stammered. "We don't know who, but the damage." Brian didn't wait to hear the rest. He pushed past the smoke and debris, his mind racing. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated. And he had a sinking feeling he knew who was behind it. As he stepped into the smoke-filled room, he spotted something that confirmed his worst fears. Scrawled across the wall in black paint were the words, "This isn't over, Warden." Brian's fists clenched at his sides. Derek Simmons had just made his move, and Brian knew this was only the beginning of what would come next. The smell of burnt wiring and charred concrete filled the air as Brian surveyed the damage. The graffiti on the wall felt like a personal taunt, a clear message from Derek Simmons. Brian's jaw tightened as his eyes darted over the wreckage. Smoke still lingered in the room, making it difficult to see the full extent of the destruction, but it was enough to know this wasn't just vandalism, it was sabotage. Guards were shouting orders, some working to put out small fires while others attempted to restore order among the panicked inmates. Brian turned to the head of security, Carter Reeves, who had just arrived, his face grim. "How bad is it?" Brian asked, keeping his tone steady. Reeves shook his head. "Bad enough. The blast knocked out power to half the East Wing, and we've got 3 guards with minor injuries from the shrapnel. No inmates were hurt, but they're rattled." Brian's gaze shifted to the crowd of inmates pressed against their cell bars, shouting and banging for answers. He knew the situation could escalate quickly if they felt unsafe. "Get maintenance down here to assess the damage," Brian ordered. "And double the guard rotation until power is restored. I don't want any gaps in coverage." Reeves hesitated. "Warden, this was deliberate. Whoever did this knows the prison inside and out. If it's who we think it is." "It is," Brian interrupted, his voice firm. "And I'll handle it." Reeves gave a reluctant nod before stepping away to carry out the orders. Brian stayed behind, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the taunting message on the wall. This was Derek's way of drawing a line in the sand, daring Brian to cross it. By the time the fires were extinguished and order restored, dawn was breaking. Brian sat in his office, exhausted but determined. Jessica arrived, a steaming cup of coffee in hand and concern etched on her face. "I heard about the explosion," she said, placing the cup on his desk. "Are you okay?" Brian nodded, though his tired eyes betrayed him. "Physically, yes. But this isn't just about me. Simmons has escalated, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants, or I stop him first." Jessica frowned. "Do you have proof it was him?" "Not yet," Brian admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But the message on the wall makes it clear. He wants everyone to know it's him without giving me enough to act." Jessica sat down across from him. "Then we need to change the narrative. If we can't pin this directly on Simmons, we can at least start dismantling his support system. There's no way he pulled this off alone." Brian nodded slowly. "The guards. Some of them are still loyal to him. If I can isolate them, he'll lose his leverage." Jessica smirked. "And I assume you have a plan for that?" "I always do," Brian replied, though his confidence was more measured this time. Later that day, Brian convened a meeting with the guards. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken tension. Derek was conspicuously absent, and Brian used that to his advantage. "I'm sure you're all aware of what happened last night," Brian began, his voice calm but commanding. "An attack like this doesn't happen without inside knowledge. Someone here is working against the safety of this facility, and I will find out who." The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Brian could see the cracks forming in their solidarity, and he pressed further. "If you know anything about last night's events, now is the time to speak up. There will be no repercussions for coming forward. But if I find out you withheld information, the consequences will be severe." Silence. Brian let it stretch, the weight of his words settling over the room. Finally, a hand went up in the back. It was Ethan Matthews. "Warden," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. I think I saw something." The room stiffened as all eyes turned to him. Brian nodded, encouraging him to continue. "After the explosion," Ethan said, "I saw Simmons leaving the East Wing. He looked like he knew something was going to happen. I didn't think much of it at first, but now." Brian's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, Matthews. I'll need you to put that in writing." Ethan nodded, his face pale but resolute. The other guards murmured among themselves, the once solid wall of loyalty to Simmons beginning to crumble. As the day wore on, Brian worked tirelessly to gather evidence. Surveillance footage showed Derek near the East Wing shortly before the explosion, though it wasn't enough to definitively link him to the act. Still, it was a start. That evening, Brian decided to pay Derek a visit. He found him in the staff locker room, leaning casually against a bench, his expression smug. Well, Derek drawled, not bothering to hide his disdain. "If it isn't the man of the hour." Brian didn't rise to the bait. "We need to talk." "Do we?" Derek said, feigning innocence. "Because last I checked, I'm still an officer here. You can't pin anything on me." Brian stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "You think this is a game, Simmons? You think you're untouchable? Every move you make, I'm watching. Every mistake, I'm documenting. And when the time comes, I will personally escort you out of this prison in handcuffs. Derek's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. Big talk for someone who doesn't have the guts to follow through. Brian leaned in, his voice a quiet threat. Try me. Derek's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Brian turned and walked out, his heart pounding. He knew the confrontation was far from over, but it was a necessary step. That night, as Brian reviewed the day's reports, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jessica. Check the West Wing surveillance footage from last night. Something's off. Brian frowned, immediately pulling up the feed on his computer. As he fast-forwarded through the footage, something caught his eye. A shadowy figure was seen entering the utility room just minutes before the explosion. Brian paused the footage, his blood running cold. The figure wasn't wearing a guard's uniform, it was an inmate. He zoomed in, his breath catching as the blurry image became clearer. It was James Carter. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Derek wasn't working alone. He had recruited the inmates, and now, Brian was facing a battle on two fronts. And he had no idea who to trust. Brian stared at the paused footage, his mind racing. James Carter. The man whose desperation he had tried to quell, the inmate who had seemed grateful for his intervention. Now there he was, caught in the act of entering the utility room just before the explosion. Why? The question burned in Brian's mind. Was it coercion? Revenge? Or had Carter always been part of a larger scheme? And more importantly, what was Derek Simmons offering to gain such loyalty from an inmate? Brian pushed the chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He grabbed his phone and called Jessica, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Jessica, I need everything we have on James Carter, he said. Background, disciplinary record, anything that might explain why he'd work with Simmons. You think Simmons flipped him? Jessica asked, her voice laced with urgency. I don't think I know, Brian replied. He's in this up to his neck. I just need to figure out how deep it goes. I'll get on it, Jessica said before hanging up. Brian sat back, his eyes narrowing at the image on the screen. If James Carter was involved, it meant the inmates weren't just pawns in Simmons's game, they were active participants. And that made the situation far more dangerous. The next morning, Brian made his way to the East Wing, where Carter was being held. The guards stationed outside his cell looked uneasy, their body language tense. Open it, Brian ordered. One of the guards hesitated. Warden, are you sure? He's been agitated since the explosion. I didn't ask for an assessment, Brian said sharply. Open the cell. The guard fumbled with the keys, the metal jangling as he unlocked the heavy door. As it swung open, Brian stepped inside. Carter was seated on the small metal cot, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes met Brian's, unflinching and defiant. Warden, Carter said with a smirk. To what do I owe the pleasure? Brian folded his arms, his tone cold. You tell me, Carter. Want to explain what you were doing in the utility room before the explosion? Carter's smirk faded slightly, but he quickly replaced it with a casual shrug. Don't know what you're talking about. I have footage, Brian said, his voice hard. Don't insult my intelligence. You were there, and you didn't act alone. Talk. Carter leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. You think I'm stupid? You think I'm gonna snitch? Nah. Whatever you think you've got on me, it doesn't matter. I ain't saying a word. Brian stepped closer, his eyes boring into Carter's. This isn't about loyalty or fear, Carter. This is about survival. Do you really think Simmons is going to protect you if things go south? You're expendable to him. But if you cooperate with me, I can protect you. Carter hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Brian thought he might crack, but then the defiance returned. I'll take my chances, Carter said, his voice firm. You don't scare me, Warden. None of you do. Brian stared at him for a long moment before stepping back. Have it your way, he said, his tone icy. But remember this, Simmons doesn't care about you. When the time comes, he'll throw you under the bus without a second thought. And when that happens, don't come crying to me. He turned and walked out of the cell, the door slamming shut behind him. Carter's smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. Back in his office, Brian reviewed the growing file of evidence. Jessica had sent over Carter's background, and it painted a troubling picture. A history of violence, multiple altercations with other inmates, and several instances of refusing orders from guards. But what stood out most was his connection to Derek. Carter had been assigned to Simmons's watch for nearly 2 years. During that time, his behavior had shifted. Where he'd once been volatile and unpredictable, he became quieter, more focused. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Derek had recruited him, likely using a mix of intimidation and promises to gain his loyalty. Jessica entered the office, her expression grim. "You're not going to like this," she said, dropping a file on the desk. I dug deeper into Carter's recent activities. He's been moving contraband, drugs, cigarettes, you name it. And guess whose name keeps coming up in the reports? Derek Simmons, Brian said, already knowing the answer. Jessica nodded. He's using Carter to run his little empire inside the prison. And the explosion? That was probably a distraction. Simmons is playing a much bigger game than we realized. Brian ran a hand over his face, frustration mounting. I need to cut this off at the source. If we can take out Derek's network, the whole thing will collapse. Jessica leaned forward, her voice low. That's going to take time, Brian. And Simmons isn't going to wait around while you dismantle his operation. He'll come at you harder. Let him, Brian said, his voice firm. The more he pushes, the more mistakes he'll make. Later that night, Brian called another meeting with the guards. This time, he laid everything on the table. The corruption, the contraband, the explosion. It all came back to Derek Simmons and his influence over both the guards and the inmates. I know some of you have been complicit in this, Brian said, his voice steady. And I'm giving you one chance, just one, to come forward. If you do, I'll make sure you're not dragged down with Simmons. But if you stay silent, I promise you when I take him down, I'll take you with him. The room was silent, the weight of Brian's words hanging heavily in the air. Slowly, one guard raised his hand, then another. By the time the meeting ended, Brian had a list of names, guards who were willing to testify against Derek in exchange for leniency. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep the momentum going. As Brian prepared to leave for the night, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You think you're untouchable, Harris? Watch your back." Brian stared at the screen, his grip tightening on the phone. Derek was getting desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. The battle lines had been drawn, and Brian knew the next move would determine the fate of Greystone, and everyone in it. Brian sat in his office, the threatening message still glowing on his phone. He tapped the screen, forwarding it to Jessica without a word. Her reply came almost instantly. "We need to trace this. Don't delete it." He stared at the phone for another moment before setting it down. Derek's message wasn't just a threat, it was a signal. The man was growing bolder, his moves less calculated, more emotional. That made him unpredictable, but also vulnerable. Brian's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Ethan Matthews stepped in, looking uneasy. "Warden," Ethan said, shifting on his feet. I think you should know something." Brian gestured for him to sit. "Go ahead." Ethan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "Simmons has been meeting with Carter. Late at night, in the workshop. I didn't think much of it before, but after the explosion." Brian's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about these meetings?" "Not much," Ethan admitted. "But they're up to something. And it's not just Carter. There are a few other inmates involved. Guys who usually don't talk to anyone, but they listen to Simmons." Brian nodded, filing the information away. "Good work, Matthews. Keep your eyes open. And if you see anything else, you come straight to me." Ethan stood, giving a nervous nod before leaving. Brian leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The workshop. If Simmons and Carter were meeting there, it wasn't random. The workshop had tools, machinery, and more importantly, fewer cameras. It was the perfect place to plan something without being seen. That night, Brian decided to investigate the workshop himself. He moved quietly through the dimly lit corridors, avoiding the main routes where guards might question his presence. As he approached the workshop, he slowed, listening for any sounds from within. Voices. Brian pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear, urgent, conspiratorial. He edged closer, peeking through the narrow window in the door. Inside, Derek Simmons stood with James Carter and 2 other inmates. A large blueprint was spread across the workbench, and Simmons was gesturing emphatically, pointing to various spots on the paper. Carter nodded, his expression serious, while the other two men seemed nervous but attentive. Brian couldn't make out the details of the blueprint, but the urgency in their body language was unmistakable. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't small. Suddenly, Carter looked up, his eyes narrowing. Someone's out there. Brian froze, his heart pounding. He ducked back into the shadows, barely avoiding being seen as the door swung open. Carter stepped into the hallway, scanning the dim corridor. After a moment, he shrugged and turned back inside. "You're paranoid," Simmons muttered, his voice fading as the door closed. Brian waited until the voices resumed before slipping away. His mind raced as he made his way back to his office. The blueprint had been large, detailed, too detailed for something trivial. Whatever Simmons was planning, it was dangerous, and Brian needed to act fast. The next morning, Brian called Jessica. As soon as she arrived, he relayed what he had seen, describing the blueprint and the meeting. "We need to know what that plan is," Jessica said, her brow furrowed. "And we need it yesterday." Brian nodded. "I've got a list of guards willing to talk. Maybe one of them knows something." Jessica leaned forward. "Be careful with this, Brian. If Simmons gets wind that you're closing in on him, he'll escalate." "I'm counting on it," Brian replied grimly. Brian spent the rest of the day questioning the guards who had agreed to cooperate. Most of them knew little, but one guard, a middle-aged man named Harris Dunn, provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. "I don't know all the details," Dunn admitted, his voice low. "But Simmons has been talking about taking over the prison." Brian's eyebrows shot up. "What do you mean, taking over?" Dunn glanced around nervously, even though they were alone. "He's rallying the inmates, building alliances, promising them freedom, power, whatever they want." The explosion? That was just a test. He's planning something bigger. Brian's stomach churned. "How big?" "Big enough to put us all in danger," Dunn said. "He's got people on the inside, guards too. If this goes down the way he's planning, it's going to be chaos." Brian leaned back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about corruption or control, it was a coup. Simmons wasn't content with undermining Brian. He wanted to overthrow the entire system. That night, Brian called an emergency meeting with Jessica and the most trusted members of his team. He laid out everything he had learned, sparing no details. "We're dealing with a coordinated effort," Brian said. "Simmons isn't just working with inmates, he's got guards in his pocket. If we don't shut this down now, people are going to get hurt, or worse." Jessica nodded, her expression grim. "Do we have enough to bring in outside help?" "State authorities." "Not yet," Brian admitted. "We need more concrete evidence. But we can't wait for them to act. We need to contain this before it gets out of control." One of the senior guards, a no-nonsense woman named Carla Vargas, spoke up. "What's the plan, Warden?" Brian took a deep breath. "We lock down the prison. No movement between wings without clearance. We monitor every call, every visitor, every interaction. And we focus on the workshop. That's where this is all coming together." Jessica frowned. "Simmons will see that coming. He'll find another way." "I'm counting on it," Brian said. "The tighter we squeeze, the more desperate he'll get. And when he makes his next move, we'll be ready." The lockdown was implemented the next morning. Guards were stationed at every checkpoint, and surveillance was ramped up across the facility. The inmates were restless, the tension palpable. Simmons, however, seemed unfazed. He moved through the prison with his usual swagger, his smirk firmly in place. But Brian could see the cracks beneath the surface. Simmons was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than Brian expected. Late that night, alarms blared throughout the prison. Brian, already on edge, grabbed his radio. "What's happening?" he demanded. The reply was frantic. "Riot in the West Wing. Multiple guards down." Brian's blood ran cold as he bolted from his office, his heart pounding. When he reached the West Wing, the scene was chaos. Inmates were flooding the corridors, shouting and throwing anything they could find. Guards were struggling to hold the line, their batons swinging wildly. And in the center of it all, standing like a general surveying his battlefield, was Derek Simmons. His eyes met Brian's, and he smiled, a chilling, triumphant grin. Brian's fists clenched as he stepped forward, his voice booming over the chaos. "Simmons, this ends now. The din of the riot in the West Wing momentarily quieted as Brian's voice echoed through the corridor. Inmates paused, their rage tempered by curiosity. Derek Simmons turned slowly, his grin widening as he faced the warden. The flickering fluorescent lights above cast eerie shadows across his face, making him look almost smugly untouchable. "This ends when I say it ends, Warden," Simmons replied, his voice carrying over the chaos. He gestured to the crowd of inmates behind him. "You see this? They're tired of your so-called reforms. They know who really runs this place." Brian stepped forward, keeping his composure despite the knot tightening in his gut. "You've already lost, Simmons. You think these inmates will follow you to the end? They're not loyal, they're scared. And when this is over, you'll be the one left standing alone." Simmons chuckled, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong. They're not scared, they're angry. Angry at the system, angry at you. And tonight, they're taking it back." He raised his baton, signaling the inmates to charge. The tension broke like a dam, and chaos erupted again. Inmates surged forward, shouting and swinging makeshift weapons. Guards scrambled to hold the line, and Brian dove into the fray, determined to stop this madness. Brian moved through the melee with a singular focus: reach Simmons. He dodged a swinging pipe, shoving the attacker aside, and grabbed a fallen baton from the ground. The air was thick with the sounds of shouting, metal clanging, and the acrid smell of sweat and smoke. Ahead, Simmons barked orders, directing the inmates like a battlefield commander. He saw Brian coming and smirked, stepping back toward a group of loyal inmates who closed ranks around him. "You want me, Harris?" Simmons taunted. "Come and get me." Brian didn't hesitate. He charged, weaving through the throng of rioters. His baton clashed with a lead pipe wielded by one of Simmons's men, and he shoved the inmate aside with a well-placed strike. Another rushed him, but Brian sidestepped, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. Finally, he reached Simmons, who stood waiting with his baton raised. "You should have stayed in your office, Warden," Simmons sneered, swinging the baton at Brian's head. Brian blocked the blow, the impact reverberating through his arm. "And you should have stayed in your lane," Brian shot back, countering with a strike that grazed Simmons's shoulder. The two men clashed in a brutal, frenetic battle. Simmons was strong and vicious, but Brian's determination outweighed his opponent's brute force. Each swing, block, and counter was a fight for control, not just of the prison but of the ideals that had brought Brian back here in the first place. As the fight raged on, the riot around them began to wane. Guards, emboldened by Brian's presence, regained control of the inmates. Tear gas filled the air, forcing the rioters to retreat. The chaos was ebbing, but Brian and Simmons remained locked in combat. "You don't belong here," Simmons roared, his voice tinged with desperation. He swung wildly, his strikes losing precision. Brian sidestepped, delivering a crushing blow to Simmons's wrist. The baton fell from Simmons's hand, clattering to the ground. Before Simmons could recover, Brian slammed him against the wall, pinning him there with the weight of his body. "Neither do you," Brian said, his voice low and steady. "It's over." For the first time, Simmons looked truly afraid. Guards rushed in, pulling Simmons from Brian's grip and forcing him to the ground. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and he was dragged away, his shouts of protest fading as he disappeared down the corridor. When the West Wing was finally secured, Brian stood in the center of the devastation, catching his breath. Inmates were being herded back to their cells, the injured were being treated, and the remaining contraband was being confiscated. Jessica appeared beside him, her face pale but resolute. "Are you okay?" she asked. Brian nodded, though his exhaustion was evident. "It's done. Simmons is out of the picture. For now," Jessica said, her tone cautious. "But this riot wasn't just about him. He's been feeding off the resentment and anger in this place. If we don't address that, someone else will take his place." "I know," Brian said. "But tonight was a turning point. The guards who stood with him saw what happens when you choose the wrong side. The inmates saw that their so-called leader wasn't invincible. We'll rebuild from here." Jessica nodded, her expression softening. "You did good, Brian." Later that night, Brian sat in his office, replaying the events of the riot in his mind. He knew this victory was just the beginning. Greystone was a broken system, and repairing it would take more than just removing one corrupt guard. It would take time, trust, and a willingness to confront the systemic issues that had allowed someone like Simmons to thrive. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. Ethan Matthews stepped in, looking hesitant. "Warden, I just wanted to say thank you," Ethan said, "for standing up to Simmons. A lot of us were too scared to do anything, but you showed us it's possible." Brian offered a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Matthews. But this isn't about me. It's about all of us, guards and inmates. We're going to fix this place, but it's going to take everyone doing their part." Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "You've got my support, Warden. Whatever you need." As Ethan left, Brian leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time since he'd walked back into Greystone, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The aftermath of the riot left Greystone Correctional Facility in a state of fragile calm. Cleanup crews worked tirelessly to repair the damage, while the guards tried to restore a semblance of order among the inmates. Despite the tension lingering in the air, there was a sense that a shift had occurred. The old hierarchy of fear and intimidation, once orchestrated by Derek Simmons, had been dismantled. Brian Harris, however, knew better than to assume the fight was over. He sat in the surveillance control room, reviewing footage from the riot. Beside him, Jessica scanned reports on her tablet, her brow furrowed. The guards had managed to recover several makeshift weapons and a few contraband items during the chaos, but something wasn't adding up. "You see it too, don't you?" Jessica asked, glancing at Brian. Brian nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. This wasn't just about the riot. Simmons had a larger plan. He wanted more than control, he wanted power. "There's something we're still missing." Jessica tapped her tablet, pulling up a list of items recovered from the inmates. "What about the blueprint you saw in the workshop? Did you find it during the sweep?" Brian shook his head. "No. It wasn't in the workshop, or anywhere else we've looked. Either Simmons destroyed it, or someone else has it." Jessica frowned. "If that blueprint detailed something bigger, we can't let it slip through the cracks. Whoever has it might try to pick up where Simmons left off." Brian leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "We need to find out who else was involved. Simmons wasn't working alone, and Carter isn't the only inmate he recruited." Jessica sighed. "Then we start with Carter." Again. The following morning, Brian stood outside James Carter's cell. The inmate was sitting on his cot, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the wall. His defiance hadn't waned, but there was a flicker of something else, uncertainty. "Open it," Brian ordered the guard on duty. As the door creaked open, Carter turned his head, his expression neutral. "Back for round 2, Warden?" Brian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You know why I'm here, Carter. You worked with Simmons. You were part of his plan. The riot didn't go the way he wanted, but you and I both know there's more to this." Carter shrugged. "I don't know what you're talking about." Brian folded his arms, his voice firm but calm. "You can play coy all you want, but here's the reality. Simmons is done. He's not coming back. Whatever promises he made, whatever deals he offered, they're worthless now. You're on your own." Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Brian leaned in slightly, his tone softening. "Look, I get it. You think talking makes you weak, or maybe you're scared of retaliation. But if you keep protecting him, you'll go down with him. Is that what you want?" Carter's eyes flickered with hesitation. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. Brian pressed on. "Help me clean up this mess, Carter. Tell me what Simmons was planning, and I'll make sure you're not caught in the fallout." The silence stretched, the tension in the cell thick. Finally, Carter sighed, running a hand over his face. "Fine. But I want protection. No solitary, no extra lockdowns. I talk, and you keep me safe." "You have my word," Brian said, his voice steady. Carter nodded reluctantly. The blueprint. It wasn't just about the prison. Simmons was planning a full-scale breakout. He had guys on the outside ready to move when the time was right. Brian's eyes narrowed. How was he planning to do it? Carter hesitated, then glanced at the wall. The tunnels. Old maintenance tunnels that run under the east wing. Most of them are sealed off, but Simmons found a way to open one up. That's where we were meeting, planning the route, setting up supplies. Brian's stomach sank. The maintenance tunnels were a relic of the prison's early days, long forgotten and thought to be inaccessible. If Simmons had managed to reopen one, it explained the blueprint, and the explosion. Who has the blueprint now? Brian asked. I don't know, Carter admitted. Simmons gave it to one of the guards before the riot. I don't know who, but he said it was someone he trusted. Brian's mind raced. A guard with access to the blueprint meant the threat wasn't over. If they were still loyal to Simmons's cause, they could try to finish what he started. Back in his office, Brian relayed everything to Jessica. Her reaction was immediate. We need to seal off those tunnels, she said, her tone urgent. If there's even a chance someone else is planning to use them. We will, Brian interrupted. But first, we need to find that blueprint. If it's in the hands of a guard, they'll have access to areas the inmates don't. We can't risk them disappearing before we know who they are. Jessica nodded, already pulling up the staff roster on her tablet. I'll cross-reference recent activity logs, see if anyone's been spending unusual time near the East Wing. If we're lucky, we'll find our culprit. Brian sighed, leaning back in his chair. No luck about it. We'll find them. That evening, as Jessica combed through the logs, Brian received an anonymous tip. A handwritten note slipped under his office door read, "It's not over. Check the old storage room near the workshop." Brian's instincts flared. It could be a trap, but it could also be the break he needed. He grabbed his radio, calling for backup, and made his way to the storage room. The air grew colder as he approached, the dim hallway illuminated by flickering lights. When he reached the door, he paused, listening. Faint shuffling sounds came from inside. He pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was filled with old equipment, broken furniture, and dusty crates. At first glance, it seemed empty. But then he saw it, a figure crouched near the back, rifling through a pile of papers. "Freeze!" Brian commanded, his voice echoing. The figure bolted, shoving past Brian and making a break for the door. Brian grabbed their arm, wrestling them to the ground. As they struggled, the flashlight illuminated their face. It was Carter Reeves, the head of security. Brian's breath caught as he realized the implications. Reeves wasn't just complicit, he was the insider Simmons had trusted. And if Reeves had the blueprint, it meant the plan was still in motion. Before Brian could react further, Reeves shoved him hard, breaking free and disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Brian scrambled to his feet, shouting into his radio. "Reeves is the mole. Lock down the prison now." The sound of alarms blaring filled the corridor as Brian sprinted after Reeves, his heart pounding. The hunt was on, and the stakes had never been higher. The alarms wailing echoed through the halls as Brian raced down the dim corridor, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the walls. Reeves had a head start, but Brian wasn't about to let him slip away. The faint sound of hurried footsteps guided him, growing louder as he closed the gap. "Reeves!" Brian shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. "Stop now, and I'll consider leniency." No response. The footsteps quickened. Brian pushed harder, his breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Rounding a corner, he caught sight of Reeves disappearing through a metal door that led toward the East Wing, the direction of the tunnels. Brian's heart sank. Reeves wasn't running blindly, he was heading straight for the escape route Simmons had planned. Brian burst through the door, emerging into a stairwell that descended into the lower levels of the prison. The faint hum of old machinery filled the air, mingling with the sharp echoes of Reeves's hurried movements below. "Guards, respond." Brian barked into his radio. "Reeves is heading toward the East Wing tunnels. Cut him off at all access points." A crackling voice replied, "Copy that, Warden. Teams are moving to intercept." Brian descended the stairs 2 at a time, his grip tightening on the flashlight in his hand. The air grew colder as he reached the bottom, the dim lighting casting eerie shadows along the damp, narrow corridor. The smell of mildew and rust filled his nostrils. Ahead, he caught the faint glow of a flashlight bouncing erratically, signaling Reeves's presence. Brian pressed forward, the gap between them narrowing. "Reeves!" Brian shouted again. "You don't want this to end badly. Stop now." This time, Reeves responded, his voice echoing through the corridor. "You don't understand, Harris. This place is rotten to the core. I'm doing what needs to be done." Brian gritted his teeth. "By helping Simmons? By endangering lives? You're not fixing anything, you're making it worse." Reeves didn't answer. Instead, the sound of metal scraping against metal reached Brian's ears. He rounded the final corner to find Reeves at the entrance to a sealed maintenance tunnel, struggling to pry open the heavy grate with a crowbar. Brian's flashlight illuminated Reeves, who froze for a split second before dropping the crowbar and turning to face him. In his hand was a crumpled piece of paper, the blueprint. "Give it up, Reeves," Brian said, stepping forward cautiously. "It's over." Reeves's eyes darted around, desperate, calculating. "It's not over. You think you're saving this place, but you're just patching holes in a sinking ship. Simmons was right. This system needs to collapse before it can be rebuilt." Brian took another step closer, his voice steady. "And how many lives are you willing to destroy to prove that point? Look around you, Reeves. The riot failed. Simmons is gone. You're all that's left." For a moment, Reeves hesitated. The paper in his hand trembled, and Brian could see the weight of his choices bearing down on him. But then, the desperation returned, hardening his features. "I can't go back," Reeves muttered, shaking his head. "Not after this." Brian tensed as Reeves reached for something in his pocket. In one swift motion, Reeves pulled out a knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. "Don't do this, Reeves," Brian warned, his voice calm but firm. "Put it down." Reeves lunged. Brian sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the blade. He swung his flashlight, striking Reeves's arm and causing the knife to clatter to the ground. Reeves stumbled but recovered quickly, throwing a wild punch that caught Brian on the shoulder. The two men grappled in the narrow corridor, the sound of their struggle echoing loudly. Brian managed to pin Reeves against the wall, but Reeves fought back with surprising strength, breaking free and shoving Brian backward. Reeves lunged for the knife, but Brian was faster. He kicked the blade out of reach and tackled Reeves to the ground, pinning him with his knee. Reeves struggled, but Brian's grip was unrelenting. "It's over, Reeves," Brian shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. "Stop fighting." Reeves finally went limp, his breath ragged. Guards arrived moments later, their boots thudding against the floor as they surrounded the scene. Two of them hauled Reeves to his feet and secured him in handcuffs. Brian stood, his chest heaving as he looked at the crumpled blueprint now lying on the ground. He picked it up, smoothing it out carefully. The detailed plans confirmed everything Carter had said: the tunnel, the escape route, the supplies. It was all there. Brian handed the blueprint to one of the guards. "Secure this as evidence. And make sure Reeves is placed in solitary. No contact with anyone." The guard nodded, taking the paper. As Reeves was escorted away, he turned to Brian, his expression a mix of defiance and resignation. "You can lock me up, Harris, but you can't change what this place is. Greystone will always be a prison, no matter who's in charge." Brian didn't respond. He watched as Reeves disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps fading into silence. Later that night, Brian sat in his office, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The blueprint had been secured, the tunnel sealed, and Reeves was in custody. For now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Jessica entered, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Reeves is in solitary. The guards are debriefing, and the East Wing is fully locked down." Brian nodded. "Good. But this isn't the end. We stopped the breakout, but the system that allowed Simmons and Reeves to thrive is still here. If we don't fix that, it'll just happen again." Jessica sat across from him, her voice quiet but firm. "You've already started fixing it, Brian. You've taken down two of the biggest threats this place has ever faced. The guards are starting to trust you, and the inmates are seeing that change is possible. It's not going to happen overnight, but you're making a difference." Brian leaned back, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders. "One step at a time," he said, more to himself than to Jessica. Jessica smiled faintly. "One step at a time." As she left, Brian turned his gaze to the stack of reports on his desk. The fight for Greystone was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like progress was within reach. The prison wasn't just a place of punishment, it could be a place of redemption, for both the inmates and those tasked with overseeing them. And Brian Harris wasn't going to stop until that vision became a reality.